Hi friends, I'm excited to be back and reading with you today. I've been very busy, which is why it's been so long. As you can see, I have lots of boxes behind me. I have lots of school supplies behind me. It's been a busy few weeks over here at Miss Anderson's house. I don't know about you, but I'm ready to jump back in. We were reading about Carter and his uncle, who is a shady magician who likes to pull tricks on the people watching his magic. Right, let's jump right back in. When Carter's uncle wasn't working, his eyes went cold and dark. Being around him then was like walking around in a pitch black room full of hard edges. Take a wrong step and you would stub your toe so badly it'd make you cry. Carter tiptoed a lot. "Step right up, ladies and gents," Uncle Sly called from the alley. "I've got a game that'll knock your socks off." "If he doesn't steal your socks first," Carter grumbled to himself. As his uncle worked, the sun began to set, and an unexpected chill crept over Carter. Though it was almost summer and the trees in a nearby park displayed green and glorious foliage, the clouds blocked the sun and Carter shivered. He would have pulled a scarf or a jacket out of his bag, but sadly he didn't own either. Since he had to keep watch anyway, Carter studied his uncle's hand movements. Uncle Sly had fast hands, though Carter knew his own were faster. And his preferred method of conning people out of their money was something called the shell game. It involved 3 nutshells turned upside down on a table. Uncle Sly would place a dried pea on the table before hiding it under one of the shells. Then he'd ask the game contestants to watch as he moved the shells around. When Uncle Sly stopped, the player guessed which shell held the pea. "That looks easy," said another passerby. "I'll give it a go." "Most excellent, sir." Uncle Sly placed the pea on the table, covered it with a shell, then placed the other 2 shells on each side. "Place your bet first." "That's right. Set your dollar on the table. Now keep your eyes on the shell with the pea." He moved the shells around the table, mixing them up. The passerby's eyes were locked on the shell he thought had the pea. "Okay, pick a shell, good sir," Uncle Sly said to the passerby. "It's this one," he said. "I know it is. I didn't take my eyes off it." "Interesting choice," Uncle Sly smiled. He held his breath before the reveal. Carter shook his head. The players were never right. Not unless Uncle Sly wanted them to be. This was because he had the pea stashed behind the crook of his fingers. It was all sleight of hand, a magician's skill that means using your hands quickly to move objects without anyone noticing. Carter knew sleight of hand to be a very useful skill for any magician. Most magicians would use it to pull a coin from an ear or plant a card in someone's pocket, all to earn smiles. But his uncle didn't use it to make people happy. He and other crooks would use sleight of hand to take things from them without their knowledge. As Uncle Sly pulled back the shell, there was no pea. "I'm sorry, sir, you lost. Would you like to try again?" "I never took my eyes off the shell," the passerby growled. "I'm sorry, but it seems you did," Uncle Sly said, flashing a smile at the man. But the charm wasn't working. Maybe it was that this man reminded Carter of his father, or maybe it was simply that he had finally seen his uncle dupe a victim one too many times. But Carter knew he'd be no better than Uncle Sly if he stood by and watched it happen again. So Carter came out from behind the corner where he'd been hiding. His uncle's eyes grew wide as Carter strolled up to the table. "It's a neat trick, isn't it?" he asked the passerbys. "What are you doing, boy?" Uncle Sly snarled, his jaw tightening, a vein popping out of his forehead. "Helping," Carter whispered. Uncle Sly blinked as if his anger had made him go momentarily deaf. The passerby grabbed the other 2 shells and flipped them over. There was no pea. "You no-good, dirty cheat," he shouted. Uncle Sly grabbed his money and the shells and dodged the man's swinging fists. Then Uncle Sly turned and ran up the alley as fast as he could. Carter took off down the street in the opposite direction, his satchel bouncing against his side. Behind them, the man shouted, "Police! That man's a thief! Someone get him!" This wasn't the first time Carter had to outrun the law, but it was the part he hated most. He hadn't done anything wrong, at least not to the passerby, yet if he were caught, he would still be guilty by association. So he ran. One day soon, he thought, "I'm going to stop running. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. I'm going to stop running, settle down, and live somewhere safe." If he weren't so out of breath, Carter could have laughed. No matter what he hoped, As long as he was with Uncle Sly, he'd never have what he wanted most in the world, a home. Carter walked the long way back down the hall to the halfway house where he and his uncle were staying. Looking over his shoulder, he passed through alleys, took weird turns, then backtracked, retracing his steps to see if the cops had followed. He felt nervous to face his uncle again. A harsh wind whooshed through his clothes and brushed at the satchel hanging from his shoulder. He found Uncle Sly sitting on the steps. When Uncle Sly noticed Carter approaching, he stood up and puffed out his chest like an angry ape. Carter flinched, expecting the worst. But to his surprise, his uncle said nothing, staring at him slightly instead. This was scarier to Carter than whenever his uncle screamed at him. It was so unexpected. Uncle Sly turned away, letting the door almost slam in Carter's face. Carter followed, closed the door gently, and took off his shoes. His uncle left a trail of muddy footprints in the hallway. Carter cleaned them up. "Cold night, isn't it?" asked Mrs. Zalewski in her thick Polish accent. Oh, now I'll have to come up with a Polish accent. The always smiling old woman volunteered in the kitchen, feeding those that came through the shelter. She wore a dirty blue apron and a small, sparkly diamond on a chain around her neck. "You look hungry. Would you like me to make you dinner?" she asked. "No, I'm good," Carter said. He wasn't hungry, even though he hadn't eaten since breakfast. "Rubbish," she said. "A growing boy must always eat. Come, sit down. I'll make you a grilled cheese and radish sandwich." "Grilled cheese and radish sounds perfect," Carter admitted. Ew. You see, Mrs. Zalewski made a mean grilled cheese and radish. Mean is usually bad, but in this circumstance, it means extremely delicious. Carter sat at the table in Miss Zalewski's quiet kitchen, enjoying the warmest, meltiest, crunchiest, and meanest sandwich he'd ever tasted. The woman's outrageous stories and her smile often warmed Carter with laughter, even after a horrible day out working with his uncle. It was rare that anyone ever greeted Carter with such kindness, and he'd grown fond of her. She made him wonder about his grandparents and what a life with them might have been like. "Would you like some prune juice, dearie? I mix it with this delicious orange powder when my pipes are clogged." "I think my pipes are good," Carter giggled. Uncle Sly would never have talked with him about his pipes, and if he had, he'd never have tolerated Carter giggling about them. Carter cleared Mrs. Zalewski's table and washed the dishes as she told him a tale about her childhood in Poland and Russia, and then coming to America by boat. The boat was filled with good people and crooks, too. "This diamond I wear belonged to my mother, and her mother before her, and her mother before her. When I came over, I hid it in my Matryoshka doll. You know, the Russian ones with the doll within a doll within a doll. This tiny diamond is all I have left to remind me of home." "I used to have a home," Carter whispered. "What's that, dearie?" Carter shook his head and said nothing. He liked when Mrs. Zalewski spoke of home. He didn't care if Uncle Sly thought he was being sentimental. Carter often wondered what having a real home again might feel like. Certainly it would be better than a new bed in a new town every other week. Uncle Sly stormed into the kitchen. He sat down and put on his famous fake smile for Mrs. Zalewski. "Can I have some warm soup and a cup of coffee, sweetheart?" "Of course, dear," Mrs. Zalewski said, disappearing down into the cellar. "Let me go get some more coffee beans." As soon as she was out of earshot, Uncle Sly leaned into Carter and whispered, "Today was a mess, so I need you to step up. You're going to swipe the old broad's diamond." "I don't steal," Carter said, "and she's not an old broad. She's our friend. She's been feeding us all week." "We don't have friends," his uncle spat. "Haven't I taught you anything?" "Nothing good," Carter whispered. "What was that?" Uncle Sly growled. He grabbed Carter's arm, his nails digging in, but he quickly let go as Mrs. Zalewski returned with a tin can. "Aw, thanks, sweetheart," he said to her. "You're the absolute tops." Uncle Sly put on quite a show for people when he wanted something. His earnest-looking smiles and overstuffed compliments fooled most people. Carter could see through it. Unfortunately, Mrs. Zalewski ate it up, grinning as she brewed Sly's coffee. It made Carter ill to think how easily his uncle tricked people. Like magic, smiles can warm a person's heart, but they can also be used to hide something dark and frightening. Later that night, squeaking door hinges startled Carter out of sleep, and he woke on the cold wooden floor of their single room. Though it was still dark, he watched his uncle plop down beside him, admiring a small, sparkly diamond at the end of a thin chain necklace. Carter recognized it immediately. It belonged to Miss Zalewski. Carter felt sick. A rage in his stomach grew until he could no longer contain it. Before he could stop himself, he was shouting, "Why did you take that? It's one thing to trick people in show games, but it's another to steal something so important from someone who is nice to us. Miss Zalewski doesn't deserve this. She's a good person. You don't care about anyone but yourself." Uncle Sly slipped the necklace into his pocket before flashing across the room and shoving Carter into the wall. "I raised you, took care of you, taught you everything I know, and this is how you repay me?" His uncle seethed through sour breath. "If you think you can do better on your own, go ahead. You think you're such a good person now. Just wait until your belly rumbles and you're so hungry you can't see. You'll be stealing more than necklaces in no time." "No, I won't," Carter shouted. He pushed his uncle away, grabbed his satchel, and ran out of the room. He was halfway down the stairs before he opened his hand to see Miss Zalewski's diamond necklace. He had lifted it from his uncle's pocket, the way his uncle had lifted it from Miss Zalewski's neck. Uncle Sly wasn't the only one who was good at sleight of hand. When Carter ran into the kitchen, he found Miss Zalewski awake and frantic. "Oh, Carter," she said, "I think I lost my family diamond. It must have happened before I went to bed. Could you help me look?" "I just found it in the hallway," Carter lied. "Here it is." Miss Zalewski was so relieved, tears formed at the edges of her eyes. "Let me get you some milk and cookies." "I can't," Carter said, choking back a surge of emotion. "I'm kind of in a rush." "A rush to where?" added Miss Zalewski. "It's still dark out." Carter ignored the question. "Take care of yourself and watch my uncle. He has sticky fingers." "That means you steal things." He made a bouquet of paper flowers appear out of his sleeve and handed it to the kind old woman, who only stared at him in shock. Then Carter pulled off his first vanishing act. He ran away. And that, my friend, is how Carter ended up in a train yard, running away from a terrible man and toward a new and hopefully better life. All right, that's the end of chapter 2. Next time we read, we're going to be working on chapter 3 of The Magic Misfits. Thanks for listening, friends.